Días a todos. Es un gusto estar aquí el día de hoy con ustedes. Voy a presentar a la siguiente ponente. Es la doctora Yue-Ting Siu. Ting has a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. She's a professor researcher at San Francisco State University in California in the Department of Special Education. She's also a coordinator of the Program of Visual Disabilities and assistant professor. Her main teaching responsibilities include courses in methods and visual impairment, such as medical, educational, and rehabilitation implications of visual impairment, special populations, problems in visual impairment, evaluation and coordination of strategies for future teachers, and related seminar programs. Dr. Ting's research prioritizes the connections between research and practice. Her areas of interest and work span are the following areas. Role of communities of practice in supporting the professional development of itinerant teachers, development of educational practices and technology that support multimedia accessibility, teacher adoption of technology, including professional use, assessment, and implementation with students. And it is really, I'm really thankful to Ting for being here today with us. And we'll just start. Thank you so much, Ting.
Okay. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Chris. It really is my pleasure, and it's an honor to be here today. Thank you all for joining us on a Friday morning. I know it's probably the end of a very long week, so I always appreciate coming to attend conferences such as this one. I'm so pleased to be here today because the topic of the focus of the conference is inclusive technologies. And this really is my life's work, is to ensure that as technology is adopted in the world and into our classrooms and learning environments, that its impact on students' learning and their access to education is not negatively impacted. So today's talk is called Technology is Everything, but Everything is Not Technology. And let me share my screen now so we can have some visuals. Okay, so the title is a bit vague, but essentially today I would like to talk about some ideas for all the systemic supports that are needed to support technology. So yes, technology is important. Technology is very significant for our disabled students, and especially those with visual impairments, which is my area of expertise. But there are many supports that are needed for true equity and justice when wanting inclusive education as mediated by technology. So for anybody who would like to keep in touch, I just wanted to share that my best contact is on Twitter, so at TVI_Ting. And as Chris mentioned, I'm usually found at San Francisco State University. I coordinate the program in visual impairments, and you can find our program's work also on social media at VI Program, SFSU. We have a very active YouTube channel, actually. So if anybody is interested in learning more about technologies specific to blind and low vision students, I encourage you to check out some of the videos we have on our channel that provides a lot of teacher professional development resources in that area. Okay, so aside from my professor role, a little bit more about myself. Okay, I am trained as a special education teacher with a specialized credential in visual impairments. So as an itinerant teacher of blind and low vision students, I usually go from different schools, and I see students at different sites, and most kind of number one job is I am a team coordinator, or I like to say a cat wrangler. So usually my job requires a lot of coordination with classroom teachers, technology specialists, administrators, school principals, parents, and it's trying to coordinate the team all together so that people understand the needs of a blind or low vision student. We also, as in TVIs, so teachers of the visually impaired, we often have to figure out new solutions to how to ensure access to things in the classroom for our students. So on this slide, I have a picture of MacGyver, so hopefully some people get the MacGyver reference. But TVIs are the MacGyvers of special education, where we often have to figure out new solutions with very minimal specialized materials. Of course, technology is changing that, where there's a little bit more access and less to hack. But essentially, just like MacGyver was having to figure out and troubleshoot solutions in the field, we often have to do that. So as part of being a TVI, we really are accessibility facilitators. So our job and responsibilities is much more than just as a teacher. We really have to look at the systemic supports for accessibility, looking at the accessibility of tools, of the technology, and also how technology changes how students access and interpret and perceive information. So for anybody more interested in the specific roles of vision professionals, this term accessibility facilitator is from an article that I published, Siu and Emerson, in 2017. So that's a reference for anybody who is interested. And finally, I see myself as an ally to individuals from the blind community and families of blind children, because as a typically sighted person, I have a very limited lived experience of blindness. But as an ally, I can recognize the needs from the stakeholders in the field. I can listen to my students, and I can also reach out to blind stakeholders and amplify their voices and the issues that are identified from the blind community. So I think this last part of my work is very important to understand what it means to be a non-disabled person working in the disability space. So, you know, here I am posting my picture as my MacGyver role. So, you know, as an ally, as anybody working in this space, I think it's important to understand what my stakes are in this conversation, or in other words, what are my biases that I bring to this conversation. So I wanted to just quickly mention this because everybody has a different view and approach to disability. Everybody has different perspectives of how technology fits into education. So today's opening talk is really speaking from my own biases in this. So for me, I identify first and foremost as a teacher, and as a teacher in the field. So I currently still work with students in the school district, and I think it's only from this lived experience of being a teacher in the field that I have really been witness to all the changes of modern classrooms and how technology has impacted how teachers must teach and how students are learning differently, okay? So my role as an assistant professor and actually newly minted associate professor, I see this as my secondary role, really, and it's my experience as a teacher that helps me be the professor that I can be. But as a professor, I'm also a stakeholder in teacher training initiatives and also credentialing standards. So in my position as a professor, I feel like I have more impact on the systemic issues surrounding students' learning and how technology must be integrated and how teachers must learn how to integrate technology in the classroom. So it's been very interesting to have these perspectives, both as a practitioner, but also somebody who can dictate how teachers must be trained in our state. So, you know, I also do a little bit of work as a technology research and development advisor, so working with various technology developers who are in the area of access technology, designing technologies for blind and low vision accessibility. And I am usually the education consultant there to advise on how technology must be developed to best fit the needs of the classroom, teachers, and students. So that's really fun work that I also enjoy. And then finally, I do a bit of education and consulting on multimedia accessibility. So especially as teachers and classrooms and our world is getting more oriented towards multimedia, we see digital text, digital images, videos everywhere around us. And so these are new forms of information that our disabled students must have access to. It is in fact an entitled right of everybody in a community to be able to access all these forms of information. So on the other side of this is we have to make sure all those forms of information are truly accessible to everybody in a community. So, the concept that I'm hinting at here is that we're trying to achieve certain levels of equity through technology. And in order to start thinking about and really practicing equity through technology, there must be a consideration for how a person must navigate information with technology. So, when we think about navigating information, there's, I think, three different types of literacy involved. So number one, there's literal literacy. So how do I navigate text? How do I navigate images? How do I read it? How do I not just perceive it, but understand and comprehend the text and image information that I'm accessing? Number two, there's also digital literacy. So how do I navigate the virtual environments and the technology tools? And with digital literacy, it's a bit orientation and mobility so very similar to a person needing to know how to read a map and be able to cross a street and to get from point A to B. And how do I read the traffic lights to do that? How do I use the crosswalk? It's very similar to students needing to navigate virtual environments and navigating all the tools that come with how do I use a website successfully? How do I access my online curriculum successfully? And what tools do I need to use in order to access all the information that's available in these online systems? And speaking of online systems, number three is there's a systemic literacy now that both teachers, administrators, and students all must develop and exercise. So there's consideration for how we must navigate infrastructures around technology. So how are these systems built that support the apps and the online media? How are the systems built to make sure that all classrooms have access to the technology they need? And it's not just the wealthier school districts with more resources. How do we make sure that all students who need specialized technology have the technology they need to navigate the information in the world and in their lives? Okay, so many systems here that we'll talk a little bit more about. So for those who might not have a lot of direct experience working with blind and low vision students, I wanted to touch a little bit upon the role of technology for blind and low vision students, because it has changed very drastically in, I would say, probably the last 5 years maybe. How technology fits into a blind and low vision student's life is very different. Number one, with technology, there is now the potential for immediate and self-determined access to information. This means that technology allows our students not only timely access to information, but students can also decide how they want to access that information. So whether it's with low vision strategies, whether it's by auditory means, or whether it's with tactile means on a braille display. Having accessible digital information puts our students in the driver's seat of accessibility, so that the student is always in control of dictating how they want to engage with these information systems. Having good technology in place also allows our blind and low vision students to engage in authentic collaborations with peers. In the past, without good technology implemented, a blind and low vision student would always have to have a sighted adult or an assistant or even a sighted peer sitting right next to them, describing the information that's around and having to, write or type for the blind student. And now that aid, that assistant, is no longer necessary and no longer needed to sit right next to that student. That person can now actually be in the back of the room or in a different room entirely, and that person is more likely to be making sure that the media are actually accessible, so that the blind or low vision student can now collaborate directly with their typically sighted peers. So by having the media and accessible systems in place, technology can empower students to dictate their own access points and tools, to say, this is how I want this information, this is when I want it, this is what I want to use to engage with the information. And when students have good access, and not just to get to the information, but also to produce their own information and to share information, now finally our blind and low vision students can claim these positions of leadership and power in a classroom, because having access and engagement with information is what equals power. So in any community, it's the people in the room who have that access to information who hold the power. And for too long, our blind and low vision students have not had these positions of power in a classroom because they were so dependent on somebody else to facilitate their access. So it's really great now that there's all these more opportunities to take on those positions of leadership, which then translate to being able to be prepared for competitive employment and to take on those positions of leadership in a student's community and in their greater community, in their workplace and education and employment. Okay. So a little bit more about how we've been transitioning in the last 5 or 10 years. You know, we've also transitioned a bit, or we're mid-transition from using the word assistive technology to access technology. And by using the word access technology, it's really more emphasizing the power of technology to access information. And no longer is it this sort of deficit model of assisting. Okay. However, as we talk about technology being able to support students' independence, what we're really talking about is the idea of interdependence. So with interdependence, there's an understanding that there's a collaborative engagement in how technology and information work together. So there's an acknowledgement that there needs to be embedded supports and structures that support self-determined behavior, that supports one's control in how they interact with information. And it's actually not on the responsibility of the student to learn how to use the technology or to develop the skills, but rather successful engagement depends on having these supports all available. So on this slide, and this is taken from an article published by Dr. Cynthia Bennett. Cindy Bennett is a blind HCI researcher in human-computer interaction, and she's published a lot about access technology and the functioning of access technology for blind people, and it also for accessing data in science. So on this image, this graphic is authored by Dr. Bennett and her team. The left side is this independence framework where you have the environment that the non-disabled person can interact directly with, but then you have the disabled person where their access to the environment is mediated with access technology. And it's very much a linear relationship of just this disabled person depending on this AT to then access the environment. So this is a very sort of ableist assumption, an ableist view of disability, and where that responsibility of access is really placed on the disabled person. And this is what we want to move away from. This is an old model of thinking. It includes a lot of ableist assumptions of you know, how it's not my responsibility if I'm not disabled, but rather now we're looking at this model of interdependence, where now we have different persons, we have access technology, and we have the environment, and there's arrows going from one element all to the other, and it's all interchangeable. So really, it's a systemic engagement and collaborative engagement between all people, disabled or not, using access technology or not, and engaging with the environment. So if we're to move to this model of interdependence with technology, how do we empower students to access information in multiple modalities? So, you know, again, it's not just about having that technology available, but now that information is in text, image, and video format. So students now, with the affordances of technology, they can also access information visually, auditory, haptically, tactually. And so there's so many different ways to even perceive information. So in order for our students to be prepared for that, students must be have good development of their sensory skills and really understand the diverse ways of interacting with information. So this part of the preparation really does fall on the responsibility of the teacher to make sure the student has these skills. And part of that is that the educators who are preparing students for education and employment, we have to understand what the students need, and that needs to start really early. So I really believe that disabled students have to have access to technology much earlier than sighted students. They don't have the privilege of saying no to technology or saying no to screen time, because many of our, especially blind and low vision students, they can't see how technology is working in the world around them. So they're missing out on these incidental learning opportunities, and they actually need direct instruction and direct experiences, and many opportunities to just play with technology and experiment with how information can be heard or seen or felt. So there's a lot more work that needs to happen in order for our students to meet the same technology competencies as typically sighted peers. There's a lot more work that needs to go on in the background to set up our students for success. So this brings us to our catchphrase of this morning's talk, is that technology is everything, but everything is not technology. So on this slide, we have an infinity sign, or a figure 8 symbol. And this means that when we think about successful implementation of technology in education, but also in the world, there has to be equal attention paid to the environment, and also the availability and use of tools, like access technology tools, and also making sure students have the skills to use those tools. So first, I'd like to go through and talk about the environmental factors of technology, okay? And this is where that conversation about equity becomes relevant. So equity, I've used the word equity a lot, and I think a lot of us are familiar with equity, with what equity means. So on the slide here, I have a graphic of an apple tree, and the apple tree is leaning to the left a little bit, and many of the apples are falling to the left on the same side it's leaning towards. And we have two children on different height ladders, with the shorter ladder on the side that the apple tree is leaning towards, and that child can easily pick all the apples that are there. And the other child has a higher ladder so that they can also reach the tree, but on that side of the tree there aren't as many apples. So even though the child can reach the tree, there's not as many apples available. So with the idea of equity, equity implies that there are custom tools that identify and address inequality. So here, obviously, the ladders are different heights, so they've been customized to the height of the tree that each person needs. And that's just a step towards true justice in the system. And this idea in this graphic is taken from Tony Ruth's Equity series. So I think that if many of us, working in education, working in technology, if we think about where we are in stepping towards justice, many of us are situated in this step of equity, where we've got customized tools now, even on mainstream or specialized technologies. People have many ways to customize the layout of what they see or how they want to listen to information. So having custom tools, this is a great step. But is it enough? Because what we really want to get to is justice, and having justice in computing and justice in using technology. So as we move towards justice, this is where we have to think about fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. So in the justice photo, it's the same apple tree, But now you can see that there's a couple wooden beams that have been that have been used to prop up the tree. So instead of leaning to the left now, the tree is straight up and there's equal distribution of the apples on both sides of the tree. And now, each person still has a ladder, but now both people are able to reach the tree and also able to pick many apples, the equal opportunity to apples. So this is what we really need to start moving towards. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes now talking about some of those systemic factors that we need to think about to move from equity to justice. Remembering that it's that intervention at the systemic level that's going to help move us from equity to justice. So there's a few critical supports needed when we look at those systemic factors. Number one, there's critical supports needed in the local systems. So this is, by local, I mean like this is the classroom, this is that particular school, or it might be that school area, that region that the school district is in, okay? So there's two levels of supports at the local system level. Number one, we have to ensure that the learning media that's being distributed in classrooms are in fact accessible. So this takes work on two ends. I'm going to talk about the local end for now. So still, there are a lot of learning media that are produced that are not accessible. There's apps being used that are not accessible. There's online books being used that are not accessible. Not accessible meaning that students cannot use any sort of access technology to engage with that information in a way that is on par with typically sighted students. So a lot of our learning media, at least in the US, I don't know if it's better in Mexico. I always want to think that things are better elsewhere. We still have a big problem of a lot of these inaccessible materials being used. And so it oftentimes falls on the teacher of blind and low vision students or the special ed teacher to remake a lot of these materials and remediate them for accessibility. So we have a lot of highly trained, highly skilled teachers who are spending their time having to reformat a document so that it's accessible. And so this is a very big shortcoming in the K-12 kindergarten to high school system, in our primary school system, where we don't have the supports to recreate these media and to make sure that media are accessible. However, in higher ed, in college and university, there are people hired to be alternate media specialists whose jobs are to remediate inaccessible materials and make sure that professors have accessible materials in the classroom. This is a job that I think is so needed in our primary, secondary school systems in K to 12. If we were to have a job of alternate media specialists in our school systems, I think this would make a huge impact on how much labor teachers have to take on to remake these inaccessible materials. What goes hand in hand here is also there needs to be recognition and prioritizing of procurement of accessible media. So right now, districts are still spending money buying products that are not accessible, that you now have to pay people extra money to make into a format that students can actually use. Many colleges and universities have a system where you have to ensure that a product is accessible before you're even allowed to purchase it. And I think that that same sort of practice really needs to be adopted in the primary, secondary school system too, so that we don't keep creating this problem of inaccessible things when we can make sure that things that are purchased are accessible to begin with. Secondly, in our local systems, there are critical supports for building a community around accessibility. So essentially, there needs to be community expectations for access, so that it's not just that blind or low vision student and their family saying it's not fair, it's not accessible, but teachers have to recognize when things are not accessible, and teachers have to amplify those voices and say, this is not right. Every student should be able to access this. And then the school principal should be able to say, this is not right. Every student in every one of my classrooms must be able to access this. So there's a bit of community education and advocacy that needs to go on with, your local school partners, but also the regional community partners to say, hey, if there's public notices that are sent out, these should be accessible. And also federal partners, so that you have interventions both from the bottom up and from the top down levels of power. And, in the United States, we're starting with some federal partnerships where we have Section 508 compliance with the Rehabilitation Act. So there's federal regulations for accessibility. However, the accountability for organizations and companies to really meet these expectations for accessibility isn't quite there yet, and that's where education and advocacy continues to be a needed area. So, basically, when we talk about building these community expectations for access, we need to understand the easy stuff. So what I call the low-hanging fruit, that's the easy stuff. It's just talking to people to hire an alt media specialist, working with the teacher to say, hey, can we pick a book that's accessible? And then the higher hanging fruit, that's the more difficult areas for intervention. That's more like the federal levels, changing the policy, doing the advocacy work to change the policy. But we need to work from both ends so that we can meet in the middle and be able to affect change across the entire structure. So there are also critical supports needed for universal design. So universal design, it's originally a term that was coined in architecture to make sure that physical environments are universally designed. And of course, now we're talking about universal design of digital media and virtual spaces. So we're talking about learning media, making sure that it's designed in such a way that anybody can access it in flexible ways with flexible tools. We need universal design of computing environments. So making sure computers and devices are accessible, learning management systems, websites, all those tools. And of course, universal design of the actual technology. So the tools that are needed to create the media and to create the computing environments. Because remember, we also want to make sure that there's opportunities for leadership from blind people in our community. And until we actually get blind people in high competitive positions of employment and getting more blind people designing some of these technologies and in those positions of power to say, yes, we're going to design this, no, we're not going to design that, it's still always going to be an uphill battle, I think. So for universal design to happen in education, there's also got to be key partnerships between general education teachers and special education teachers. And I emphasize the word partnerships here because it's not consultation and it's not even collaboration, but it's really partnering so that everybody has equal power in these decision-making and planning processes. So Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, I believe that it must be a baseline teacher competency for all teachers. So right now in the US, only special education teachers are expected to know and understand UDL. Our general education teachers are not expected to know that. So that's why special ed teachers are always in this position where we have to educate the gen ed teachers before we can even get going on anything. Of course, my bias is that I am in teacher preparation, I am in teacher education, but I really believe that we can start intervention earlier in the teacher preparation years and start developing the habit of partnership in teacher prep programs so that you've got people in pre-service gen ed programs working very closely with special ed teacher students and getting them partnering and troubleshooting and strategizing together even in their teacher preparation programs. So that's the teacher side of universal design, but I also believe that there need to be improved foundations and training for anybody who's in the architecture of building virtual environments. So, people need to incorporate accessibility principles throughout basic developer and engineering training. This is very similar to how architects are trained, and their training in accessibility is integrated through understanding the Americans with Disabilities Act. Architects and engineers, street engineers, traffic engineers, they're all very well versed about, yes, I need wheelchair access to a building. Yes, I need curb cuts when I build a new street. These are just foundational thinking for anybody architecting physical spaces, and we need those same accessibility thinking in anybody in the virtual space. So it's just part of the design process. So, going back to the idea that our building and construction of virtual environments really parallels those of physical environments. And finally, this is probably the most important, we really need to develop key partnerships between accessibility specialists and technology developers so that tech developers are accessing the information available from accessibility specialists, and that when you think about accessibility specialists and who they must include disabled stakeholders. I think too often there's people building technology who have never spoken to a blind person or who maybe only interviewed one or two blind people, and now they think they understand the full scope of disabled people's needs. And that is not the case. I believe that every good piece of technology that works really well has inclusion of disabled partners in the conversation, in the design, development, and testing at every stage of technology. And not just as a side invitation, but really as a true partner in that design and development process. Okay, so remember, this is reflecting back to the whole technology is everything, but everything is not technology concept. And we have the two sides, right? We've got environment, which we just talked about those critical supports for. So now I want to spend a little bit of time on what are those student tools and skills that are needed to work well with the environment. So remembering that if you have a beautifully designed environment, very accessible, if the student doesn't have access to the technology they need and they don't know how to operate it, it doesn't matter how good the environment is, they're not going to be able to access it. And vice versa, you could have a student who's got the best technology available, and the student is the most advanced technology user, but if the computing environment is not accessible, it's still going to be a broken system. So we talked about the environment. Now let's go ahead and spend a few minutes on the tools and skills. Okay, so just a quick review of what was mentioned earlier. Some of the tools and technology skills that students need is they need to be able to navigate multimodal information. So being able to navigate text, images, videos, models, and being able to not just access, so not just perceive it, but truly navigate it. So a good example of this is the difference between a document that's readable versus a document that's readable but also has a table of contents, so that you have an overview of the document and you can quickly skip to what section of the document that you want to read. So having a table of contents sort of structure, that's navigation, versus if you just have pages and pages of text that's technically readable, but it's not very usable without a table of contents. Okay, so that would not be accessible. So our students need to also have proficient use of their various senses for engaging with information. So this is that teacher and family's job to make sure they've got their ears trained for low vision efficiency, auditory training, tactile discrimination if they're going to be a Braille reader. And our students also are entitled to having multiple devices in their life for learning. So students often need to have flexible use of accessible tools to navigate accessible environments. Many times a school will say, no, we only buy one device for a student. And that is absolutely inappropriate, because our students benefit from having multiple devices. Just as everybody who's listening here, I would guess that from the time you woke up until this moment, you've already touched more than one piece of technology. So in that same way, our students are entitled to having access to multiple devices for their learning, because that's how they'll need to be successful in their life as adults. And then finally, I cannot emphasize enough the idea of shifting the power dynamics in the classroom and workplace. So making sure that when tools are developed and when learning experiences are set up, students are not just being trained to access that information, but it's also, how do I create it? What's my creative expression? How am I going to produce the information that sighted peers are going to read, or my sighted teacher is going to read? Or, in the workplace, how can I have the tools to build the system that I see is necessary, rather than just being in these passive positions where, blind and low vision people are always just reacting to the environment, reacting to these bad systems that have been imposed. How do we shift that power so now disabled people are the ones creating and producing systems and information, and really designing these information experiences? Okay. So I wanted to share a little case study from the classroom. So this is a great example of how a teacher's done a really nice job setting up a student to both access information and also have opportunities for creative expression. And I think that in every single learning activity, there needs to be equal time spent on access and also creating, okay? So for example, if I'm in the classroom and we're doing a lesson on how to use my reading app to read a book, we're going to spend half the lesson reading, but we're also going to spend the other half of the lesson writing. So there's always a creating balance with access, okay? So these materials that I'm going to show you, this is shared from my friend Jessica McDowell. Jessica McDowell is an extraordinary teacher of the visually impaired. She works in California, very close to me. She's in Marin County. She's also on Twitter. She's very, very creative in how she is getting students engaged in their learning. And she's doing an amazing job training classroom staff with the expectations of how blind students need to access information in the room. So here, this is a lesson on mythical birds. And I wanted to say mythical birds because in a video I will show you in a few minutes, the student pronounces it incorrectly. So this is what he's really trying to say. It's a lesson on mythical birds. And so the picture on the top here is a very colorful picture of two birds facing one another. They're probably flying in the air in a field of flowers. And it's a very colorful scene with colorful flowers and colorful birds. Yeah. And it's a drawing of birds. So not a photo, but a drawing. And because they're mythical birds, these might not be birds that exist in reality, but they're constructed for a story. So you can imagine that in the class, the whole class would be shown this picture from a book or from a poster of these birds. And the teacher could do a great description, just like I just described the image for you, but a description is only going to help you understand this image only so much. So now, if you had not seen this picture, you could imagine, okay, there's a colorful field. Dr. Ching said there's birds flying in the air and they're facing each other and there's many colors, but they're mythical, so they might not look like any birds I've seen in reality. So now with that description, you have a generic idea of what mythical birds are, but not a very concrete idea, right? Because it's just a description. And also, when you now look at it and you have visual access, now you can construct your own visualization, your own mental map, and your own cognitive process in interpreting this image and understanding this image, and basically using some visual literacies to learn from this image, okay? So on the bottom half of this page, what the teaching assistant did was she recreated this image in a tactile format. So, when you recreate an image in a tactile format, it must be simplified, and it's not going to be a direct replication of what we see visually. So this was created with the Draftsman tool. It's a tactile drawing board. American Printing House for the Blind, their tactile drawing board is called the Draftsman, but you can also do an internet search and do a search for tactile drawing board, and you'll find a lot of different options for tactile drawing board. So the way this works is there's a rubber mat, and you have a very thin vinyl sheet that goes on top of the rubber mat, and you just draw with a hard point. So it could be a ballpoint pen if you want to make it more visible. In this case, it's drawn with a plastic stylus with just a hard point on the end. So as you draw, the line actually raises. So you don't have to draw it in inverse or anything like that. You can just draw it as is, as you like, and as you draw, it raises up. So this is the quickest way to create a tactile graphic in the classroom on the fly with no preparation. So you can imagine the teacher decides to go through and produce this image for the class, and the teacher assistant can quickly redraw the bird. And obviously, this teacher assistant is very talented. She's able to draw very well, so it makes her a really good match for this fourth grade classroom. So on the tactile drawing, it is simplified. So she's got the bird. You can tell where the bird's claws are holding onto the branch. You can tell that the bird has these feathery wings that expand out, and these long feathers, very similar to the long feathers that are in the visual image. There's also a very long beak on the bird too, and these little feathers on the bird's head. So to me, this kind of looks like the bird that's on the right side of the visual image, right? And you can imagine for a blind student, now they really get a concrete and more direct experience with the bird. And now they also have that sort of mental map and that idea of what the bird is and all the elements of the bird. But this is only one part of it, right? This is just that access point. But it's very important access because I think too often in our classrooms, students are only getting access to text. They're not getting enough access to images, and they're not getting enough access to tactile graphics. So just as sighted students have to develop a visual literacy about how to interpret pictures, how to look at a picture and get information from it, how do I learn from it, and there's pictures used in testing materials, our students, our blind and low vision students, need high quality tactile graphics every time a sighted student is expected to learn from a visual graphic. So having the tactile graphics available gets our students trained in developing their spatial literacy. So it's not necessarily visual literacy for a blind student, but it's rather spatial literacy. So, by feeling this picture of a bird, there's a spatial literacy involved in understanding the size of the feet compared to the size of the body, compared to the size of the head. There's a spatial understanding of where the feathers are, or where the wings are, or how far the beak extends from the bird's face, I guess. And there's also a spatial representation of where this bird is in space. How does the bird sit on a branch? And how does it crouch with the body more in a horizontal space, and the bird is not really necessarily upright, okay? So a lot of these spatial representations leads to that spatial literacy, and this spatial literacy is critical for students to then understand spatial concepts that are represented in math, in science, in biology, chemistry, physics, statistics, and eventually students have to learn how to interpret data visualizations. And when those are in a tactile or sonified format, students have to have already a mental map and an understanding of these spatial literacy concepts, okay? Okay, so I've talked a lot about access. I want to also give some equal time to that creative expression part. So next, I have a little video, it's very short, of the blind student telling his teacher about the tactile graphic that he has drawn. So step 1 is accessing the material in the classroom. Step 2 is now giving the student the opportunity to draw his own bird. And you can imagine the classroom lesson here. Probably every other student, after they've read the book and looked at the mythical bird's story, now every student in the classroom is getting paper out, they're drawing their own birds, and they're connecting their understanding of what mythical birds can be like. So for our blind student, we just took out the tactile drawing board again, and he was able to draw out his own bird. And so with the bird, I think it will become very clear that he has a very good concept and a very good idea of the spatialness of a bird and the proportion of the bird. and all the different elements of the bird. So he drew this tactile graphic, and his teacher has asked him to explain it, okay? And I do have permission to share this video, just so you know. So this is a totally blind fourth grader. He's been blind from birth. And this is an example of a student who's had really good access to accessible graphics his entire life. And this is the level, this is the expectation that we should have for all blind students.
So can you describe your drawing to me?
So this is the big bird, this is the tail, and these are the two big wings. And this is a large head with the two eyes, and this is the mouth.
Okay. Or on a bird, we might call it a...
Well, beak, mostly.
And then...
These are the feet. And the reason why the body has all squiggly lines, those are all feathers.
Oh, cool. And then what's back here?
Where? Oh, that's the tail. That's the tail feathers.
Is this a bird that exists now? Or is this an ancient bird? Or you're not-
Ancient, because we're doing on Mexican.
Oh, okay. So,
It's like folk art, right?
Like we can do mystical animals.
That's right.
I like
Like
that.
mostly it's like myth.
Okay, so obviously he went to say mythical birds. He is still learning the vocabulary, and he's still putting the vocabulary together. You know, it's not a mouth, it's a beak. There's the tail feathers. What's interesting to me is if you look at his tactographic, he's drawn a bird with 4 feet, right? So this is an instance, this is sort of a classic instance of a blind student who has not had those incidental learning experiences. And this is something that might need a little bit of extra direct instruction. So this is a great example of how students' concept and their conceptual development is just as important when they're needing to access and understand information, and especially important if any student is going to use technology. There has to be consideration for the conceptual development first. So, you know, any other kid in a 4th grade classroom, they know that birds have 2 feet because we see pictures of birds everywhere in life, and, you know, it's always 2 feet. However, for this child, he knows that a bird is an animal. He has dogs at home, and a dog is an animal, and the dog has 4 feet. You know, he has learned about different other animals, you know, cats have 4 feet. And a lot of the animals that he's had experience with in his life, they're all 4-legged animals. So in this case, I think it's very interesting that he drew the bird with 4 feet. And it's obvious that this is an area of conceptual development that would probably need to be revisited. And it's also an indication of who knows how much access he's had to the image of a bird. So yes, they went through this in one book, and in this particular book, the bird had 2 feet, and you know, the teaching assistant drew the tactographic of a bird with 2 feet, but maybe he just thought, well, this is one instance of a bird with 2 feet, but he's missed that most other birds in the world are two-legged, I guess, two-legged animals. So really interesting, and I'll play it again. I want to play this video again just so you can pay attention now to the language that he's using, and how he's describing this is really based on his world knowledge and his experiences, okay? Even the vocabulary that he uses is really based on what he's familiar with. So there's a lot of gaps in blind students' learning that we have to think about. Okay, let's see if I can get this to play again.
So can you describe your drawing to me?
So this is the big bird, this is the tail, and these are the two big wings. And this is a large head with the two eyes, and this is the mouth.
Okay. Or on a bird, we might call it a...
Well, beak, mostly.
And then...
These are the feet. And the reason why the body has all squiggly lines, those are all feathers.
Oh, cool. And then what's back here?
Where? Oh, that's the tail. That's the tail feathers.
Is this a bird that exists now? Or is this an ancient bird? Or you're not-
Ancient, because we're doing on Mexican.
Oh, okay. So,
It's like folk art, right?
Like we can do mystical animals.
That's right.
I like
Like
that.
mostly it's like myth.
Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I am looking at the time. I know that we're just about the end, so I have a few closing notes to share with everybody, just to kind of clarify our goals together, our community goals. So everybody here, and thank you again for being here this morning, but I believe that you guys are all here because you are stakeholders in technology and equity targets. So everybody's here because you care about inclusion. You care about the role of technology and how technology can be used to support inclusive objectives for our students. So, you know, in order for us to really move our work forward, there must be intervention at multiple levels of infrastructure. And I feel that people in this audience you guys are the perfect people to do the intervention work that's needed, because we need to intervene at the local level, the community level, the regional level, and federal levels to really build a holistic community around access and equity, to make sure that there's those bottom-up approaches from people making sure the local materials are accessible, but also those top-down approaches to make sure that there's policies and systems and accountability in place for accessibility. And then finally, you know, a lot of our work is to recognize and promote what is needed to move from equity to justice. And that's addressing those systemic factors. So remembering that equity is just making sure there's customized tools, but to really achieve justice, we have to address those systemic factors and figure out what are those wood beams that we need to build in order to make the tree upright. And with that, I wanted to thank you guys again for attending the talk this morning. I wish you a very interesting and inspired rest of the conference. And if for anybody who wants to keep in touch, I'm available on Twitter, best available on Twitter at TVI_Ting. I also have a YouTube channel and Facebook that you can find me on by looking up my full name, Yue-Ting Siu. And of course, I'm also at San Francisco State, coordinating the program in visual impairments. And you can find our social media contact for the program at VI Program SFSU. Thank you again, everybody. And I'll stop sharing my screen now. Let's see.
Thank you, Ting, for this wonderful presentation. I have been looking at the chat, and you have a lot of appraisal for your work, many comments of congratulations, and it really has been really an interesting talk. I would like, yeah, it was many comments about how interesting, how incredible your work is, and some of the questions are, how can they obtain more information about this or the project? I think you're muted.
Oh, technology. I tend to post information a lot on Twitter, so that's probably the best way to keep up with my work. I also recently published a textbook last year. It's called oh my God. Access Technology for Blind and Low Vision Accessibility, and it is available from American Printing House for the Blind. So there's a lot more information about kind of overview of technologies for blind and low vision accessibility, and also some principles of how to evaluate students' needs for technology. Yeah, that textbook is just now available.
Yes, I am aware. I have it, and it is available in digital format also, so it's downloadable really, really quick. Thank you. One more question is, can this project be implemented with other activities of higher education? Can you talk a little bit more about higher education?
Yeah, as I mentioned, actually a lot of really good models of systemic accessibility in higher education. So I think a lot of primary and secondary school administrators, they are being told that they need to do better. They're being told that they need to purchase accessible products, but they don't know how, and they maybe are not aware of these models in higher education. So I think if we look towards higher ed, we can use those as exemplars. So for example, if you can convince a school administrator to hire an alternate media specialist, there's job descriptions already available for this type of job. If you need to include accessibility in a procurement policy to say that everything purchased must be accessible, there's many exemplar language in higher ed that you can just use.
Thank you so much. There are many more congratulations coming through the chat.
Thank
Really,
you.
yeah, I think it was amazing. I have one question, and I'm sorry if I will put you a little bit on the spot, but conditions in our system in Mexico are a little bit different from the U.S. I wish we were really in this dream world, as you say, that conditions are better in Mexico. Yeah, we wish. Yeah. So I know that you at the end were very punctual in noticing that we have to work at multiple levels, right, in order to be improving in this. But my question is, if you had to start at a certain point, I mean, we know we're all working in different points and in different levels and all that, but if you were to decide what will be the most important, area or level to support, will you give us your opinion on that?
Yeah, and of course I have a bias here because I am talking as a professor now. I think that universities have a very critical role in this process because from the university level, we can change how teachers are trained. So that's the bottom-up approach. But we can also advise on teacher training standards at the state level to say that this is how teachers need to be trained for accessibility. And we can also say to the federal, policymakers, this is what we need to expect of our education systems. So, this is maybe my optimism, but I do feel that universities are very well positioned to affect those changes from both top and bottom.
Yeah, thank you so much. I agree with you in that. And this is why I also work with teacher development and all that. I don't know, is anybody else having questions? There's a lot of congratulations again from different parts of Latin America and even from Spain, from Peru, from Ecuador.
Wow.
Yeah, I think you have reached a lot of people and everybody's is really impressed about your conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. My husband's family is from Ecuador, so I love that there are people from Ecuador here.
Yeah, I don't know, Dr. Sandoval, would you like to proceed with the certificate?
Thank you.
Yeah, we really want to thank you. I know this was really a great conference in general, and your talk was a really highlight for the last day. So would like to present to you the certificate for outstanding participation as a keynote speaker with a keynote entitled "Technology is Everything, but Everything is Not Technology," presented to Dr. Yue-Ting Siu on the day on today, on October 29th, 2021. And I guess that with that, thank you very much to everyone who has been attending this conference. Have a good day.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Muchas gracias.